Hello, and welcome to an absolute beginner crash course in Adobe Illustrator. I am Sam Shimoda, and I will be walking you through some beginner through intermediate level things that I think are foundational to understanding how Illustrator works and kind of bridging the gap between just kind of getting around and actually making something worthwhile. The reason I'm making this tutorial is I have a friend who is making the transition from a Photoshop-only digital art process to an Illustrator-augmented digital art process. And I know from experience just how frustrating it can be to dive into Adobe Illustrator for the first time and not really understand what on earth is going on with this thing. I know my first experience with it when I was a teenager was, why can I not draw with this? It's called Illustrator and I can't draw with it. I don't understand what's going on. I got tremendously frustrated just poking around with it. Of course, I was a teenager and my patience level was practically zero, but I ended up putting it down for years and sticking with Photoshop because it was comfortable and it made sense. And I only came to Adobe Illustrator much later when I started doing freelance work that was very, very large scale, and I had to work with vectors. So I learned how to use it at that time. But my hand was definitely forced. But once I got into it, I found that I absolutely love this program. It's so powerful and so awesome. And I'm really excited to share it with you. To start, I am using the Essentials workspace. One of the things that you can do over here is if you click on your window pull down, you can go to Workspaces and you can choose from a series of workspaces. And the Essentials workspace is just the bare essentials. This is the stuff that I'm going to be using just to start to kind of show you around. And then I'm going to start to add some things in just a little bit later as they become relevant. So let's begin. First of all, we're going to take a look at the selection tools. There are two different selection tools in Adobe Illustrator. There is the selection tool, which is up here on the top of your tool panel, and then the direct selection tool, which is the second item on your toolbar. Now, you're probably asking, why do I need two different selection tools? The selection tool itself is for selecting parent level objects. You have your paths and your objects and your text boxes and stuff like that, and they can be organized into groups and so on and so forth. And those things will be moved around with your selection tool. So I've built this kind of example of what the selection tool looks like to use. If, say, for example, I make a circle over here, you can see I'm getting a bounding box that is showing the maximum footprint of the object that I have selected. And then using these nodes on the sides and the corners, I can grab them and resize my object. I can hold Shift and resize my object to scale. I can grab just one to drag in a particular direction. I can also, if I mouse close to these corners, I can rotate an object. Now, the direct selection tool, when I switch to that, you'll see that my bounding box disappears. And now I can see the individual points on this path. And now if I click on one of those, I can see what are called handles that are coming off of either side of this point. And I can select individual points and move those around. So the selection tool is for macro level transformations, and the direct selection tool is for micro level transformations. So again, you'll see points and you'll see handles coming off of those points. Next, we have the path itself. First, I'll talk about anchor points and end points. When you create a path, or when you're editing a path, each point in that path is called an anchor point. Say you have an open path, something like this. These points on the end are called endpoints versus a closed path. This has no endpoints. Smooth points are points that have two direction lines. This happens when, say, for example, you create a circle, highlight one of those points with the direct selection tool. You can see that there are two direction lines coming off of that. And if I grab one of the handles, they both pull together. Now I can use a handle and pull one handle out longer than the other. That gives me some control over the curve. But anytime I kind of adjust the angle of this, it's going to adjust both of those handles. This is a smooth point. Corner points have 0, 1, or 2 direction lines on them. So in this case, these endpoints have 0 direction lines. This point has 1 direction line, and this point has 2 direction lines. In practice, that looks like this. And you'll notice with a corner point that has 2 direction lines, these two things are broken apart. And this one only has 1. So basically any point that has 0, 1, or 2 and the direction lines are broken apart from each other is called a corner point. Next up, we have path-related tools. The pencil tool, which is right here. And this tool allows you to draw paths. Now, there are a few subtleties to this tool. One is if you double-click on the tool, you will get some fidelity options. You'll get some other options here too. The fidelity options are between accurate and smooth. The further on this scale you are, the more accurate your final line will be. So there will be many points there trying to pick up all of the intricacies of the line that you've just drawn. Versus if I change this all the way to smooth and I draw something kind of similar, we can see there are significantly fewer anchor points on the second line that I drew that was set to smooth. For the most part, I keep this centered between the two. I personally find that I don't go accurate unless I have something very specific I'm trying to accomplish. Likewise, smooth tends to smooth things out just a little more than I like. So I keep it in the middle. If you have a line selected and you are using the pencil tool, you can start drawing on the line and continue your drawing, and it will add to your current line. You can also draw along the line and divert your line and change that line. You can also hold Alt, and that will change your cursor to this, and you can draw along the line to smooth it out. So say, for example, you've got something that's like, maybe I want to get rid of this little bump here. I can smooth that out. Well, actually, I'd probably draw it, and then I can kind of smooth away the points. The pen tool is here, and this is a very versatile tool that when you click first, you establish that you are drawing a line, and by default, you will be dragging out a straight line to whatever point you put down next. If you click and drag, you can drag out a smooth point. And if you drag out a smooth point and then single click again on the point, you'll delete the other anchor and create a corner point. And then if you click on the first point in your path, you will close the path. The pen tool also, if you click on a path, will add a point to it. And if you click on a point that exists, it will remove the point. Next up, the add and delete anchor point tools. These are part of the pen tool. And you'll notice that when I have the pen tool selected, the regular pen tool, if I mouse over an anchor point, it turns into the delete anchor point tool. And if I mouse over a path, it turns into the add anchor point tool. So technically you don't need to use the add and delete anchor point tools by themselves, but I find that when I'm editing paths quickly, it's actually faster for me to switch to the add and delete anchor point tools, because when you're in a adding anchor points mode and deleting anchor points mode, it can be frustrating using the pen tool if you miss slightly. Like if I click off my path accidentally, I've created a new path and now I'm drawing a new path here. And I didn't intend to do that. So then I have to go back to the selection tool and then select my path again. Again, if I'm like trying to delete this anchor and I click off, I miss slightly, I've created an anchor point. Your lines can get very messy very quickly with this. So I just switch between them using keyboard shortcuts. But they are found if you hold this down and select them from here. Next up is the anchor point tool. Now, this is a very interesting and important tool as well. This tool gives you control over your anchor points to a degree that the pen tool does not. This allows you to create and edit direction lines and handles of anchor points that already exist in a line. And that is found up here under the pen tool if you click and hold and select anchor point tool. And what this does is if you click and drag on an existing anchor point, you will drag out handles. If you single click on a point that has handles on it, it will convert it back into a zero direction line anchor point. And if you click on a handle, you will break it away from the other handle and turn a smooth point into a corner point. And then once these are broken apart, they stay so. So using all these tools in conjunction gives you all of the control that you need over a path that you're drawing. I can also use the pencil tool to connect up paths. If I have two paths selected using the direct selection tool, and I can connect them back up. I can delete some anchor points. I can move the anchor points around. It's just, I have all the control that I need over the points now. Next up is the layer hierarchy. The layer hierarchy is over here, and I personally prefer to give this a ton of screen real estate, not necessarily as much screen real estate as you get if you're in the Essentials workspace, but I cannot stress enough how important it is to understand the layer hierarchy. One of the most fundamental things that separates Photoshop and Illustrator is that in Illustrator, every single thing that you make becomes an item on the layer hierarchy. And you can see over here, I've got my entire presentation kind of laid out. I will go over some of the features of the layer hierarchy now. So first of all, we've got some columns. On the left side, we have the visibility column. This is the little eyeball icon that you turn on and off to toggle the visibility of a layer. Next is the edit column. This is the column that creates a little lock here. And what that does is it locks that layer and disallows you from editing it. So you'll notice that I've got my headers and my background colors. That's this header up here, and my background color is just a big square that is a color. I have those locked. If I unlock that, I can now edit my background color, which obviously I don't want to do, but that is what that does. Next up is the target column. That is these little circles over here. And what these do is they allow you to select an object in your layer hierarchy from the layer hierarchy. So I can either click on something over here. I'm going to use the selection tool for this. So we're going to see the whole bounding box. You'll notice that when I have something selected, the target becomes highlighted here. This circle becomes outlined. And then on the far right, we have the selection box lights up. The target allows you to select an object just by clicking on the target. On the far right, we have the selection column. And what this shows is a colored box next to the object that we have selected. And this box is going to be biggest on the object that is selected. And then there's going to be a smaller box on any parent layer or group, and then likewise on any parent layer or group above that. So in this case, we can see that this selected object is within the slide 4 layer, which is in the tutorial presentation layer, and we see a selection box on all 3 of those things. Next up is rendering order. Rendering order is just a fancy way of saying, what can you see? The rendering order is bottom to top, which means things that are lower on the layer hierarchy are going to be behind things that are above them on the layer hierarchy. And I'm going to expand this group here, and I've got 4 circles labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 is on the bottom, and thus it is behind circle 2. And circle 2 is behind circle 3, which is behind circle 4. And using the direct selection tool, I can select objects within this group and move them around. And as you can see, circle 4 being on the top in the layer hierarchy is going to be above the other 3. Likewise, circle 4 is above the rendering order text. So if I drag it over here, it's going to be above that. Now, if I drag these around on the layer hierarchy, if I click and drag, for example, I can drag circle 4 under circle 3, and now it's going to be rendering behind it. But it's still on top of circle 2. If I dragged it all the way down here, it would be behind all the rest of the objects and behind the text as well. Next up is organization. We have objects, groups, and layers. Objects by default are going to just be your text boxes, your paths, etc. Those are things that show up just as single objects in here. There are no arrows next to single objects. This text object is just a single object. Whereas rendering order right here, this is a group. And this contains, if I click the drop-down icon, this contains 5 objects within it, and they are all grouped together. I can drag things in and out of the group. Like say, for example, I don't want circle 3 in the group anymore. I can just drag it out of the group, and now it's up there outside of the group. If I'm using my selection tool, and I click on a group, it's going to highlight the whole thing. So now I'm grabbing the entire group, excluding circle 3, which is not in that group. And I'm going to just undo that. And I'm going to put circle 3 back in the group. Layers are sort of like groups. All of this stuff is in the slide 4 layer hierarchy layer. And everything in that is showing up as yellow, because if I double click the layer, I can select the rendering color of that layer. And that is the color that it shows up in the layer hierarchy. And also all of the bounding boxes and vector indicators of all of the objects within that. So you'll notice that everything is yellow here in this slide layer, which is everything on this slide. If I go to my previous slide, this is my purple slide. So everything in this has purple indicators. And what's interesting is you can put layers within other layers. So I actually have this entire project is in one layer called tutorial presentation. And when I drop that down, I can see all the other layers that I have within that tutorial presentation. So again, objects are single objects, groups are collections of objects, and then layers are collections of both objects and groups. All right, we're going to get into a little bit of intermediate stuff here with Align and Pathfinder. First of all, I'm going to find my Align panel, which is under Window, Align, and this is going to bring up a floating window. This is true of any time you go to Window and you select something that doesn't have a checkbox here. Those are all the things in the user interface that are hidden. And when you add one that was hidden before, it's going to appear as just a floating box. And I can add that. I can either leave it as a floating box, or I can add it to my user interface by dragging it. If I drag it here, it will add that whole thing to another column of user interface items. I can drag it off. I can put it, if I drag it onto here, it will add these 3 tabs to these tabs, which I don't want to do right now. I can drag it here to put it above as well and sort of bisect this column. So I'm going to start by doing that. First, we'll start with Align Objects. This is the top row of things in Align. As a slight digression, if you double click on a group like this, you will go into isolation mode, and you'll notice that my layer hierarchy changes. Now, I'm just looking at the group that I double clicked, which was Align Objects group. It's all of this stuff. And you'll notice that everything else has sort of faded away a little bit. And you'll notice this little indicator here, this allows me to kind of click on different levels that I'm at. So I can go back to slide 5, which is isolating the entire layer of slide 5, or I can go back to tutorial presentation, which is isolating the entire layer of tutorial presentation, and I can hit escape to exit isolation mode, and then my layer hierarchy returns to normal. But I'm going to double click to go into isolation mode so that I can just use the selection tool to move things around within this. If I were outside of isolation mode, I would need to use the direct selection tool, and that doesn't work with the align tools as cleanly. So I'm in isolation mode. I'm going to select all of these objects that I want to align, and we'll just go through these one at a time. So horizontal align left, it's going to take all of the left edges of these objects and just align them by the left side. Horizontal align center will align the centers with each other, like that. Horizontal align right will align the right sides. Vertical align top, vertical align center, vertical align bottom. They're pretty straightforward. Also, if you single click on an object that is in the selection of objects that you have, you'll notice that its outside edge gets thick. That means that this is the object that will not move if you align. So now if I hit horizontal align left, everything will be aligned to that object, and that object will not move. That's a neat little trick. So now I'm going to hit escape, leave isolation mode, and we will go on to distribute. So again, I'm going to go into isolation mode by double clicking on the distribute objects group. I'm going to expand that just so we can see. And now I'm going to select all of these objects. Distribute is going to evenly space things, and you can evenly space things vertically according to the top edge, the center, the bottom edge, and you can distribute horizontally according to the left edge, center, and right edge. And what that looks like is this. In order to see what the left, center, right distribution looks like, I'm going to need to change the widths of some of these things. So I'm going to do that, and then we will align by left side, centers, and right sides. So the nuance there is fairly subtle, and you may find a use for that. I'm going to hit escape to leave isolation mode, and we will move on to shape modes and pathfinders. So over here in Pathfinder, we have shape modes and pathfinders. These are tools that allow you to cut shapes out of other shapes, add shapes together to create more complicated shapes, and so on and so forth. And I just have a series of random shapes that I've assembled here to show what some of those possibilities are. So I'm going to double click into isolation mode, and then we're going to do some stuff. So the first one I want to show is up here. This is unite. This is you take two objects and you click that and they become one object. And now my path is the silhouette of what those two paths were. My light purple square is in front of the dark purple square. If I hit minus front, it will cut the top object out of the bottom object. Minus back is the opposite of that. So it's going to cut my bottom object out of my top object. Intersect is going to take the space that they are intersecting and make that an object. So like say, for example, I've got this thing. I have these two paths and I intersect. I've now created that path. And then there's the opposite of intersect, which is exclude. It's going to exclude the point where they overlap. And then there is divide, which is going to intersect the two paths, but it's going to leave both the exclude and intersect shapes. So this is now actually three different shapes now that I've divided them. Trim is to cut one object out of the other object, but they are both still there. And the others I find less useful for beginner and intermediate level stuff. Those are things that I will let you explore on your own. Well, here we are. This is part 6, the appearance panel. And this is intermediate to advanced, but it is super awesome and so powerful. And this stuff changed my life. And I think that everybody should be aware of it, no matter what level of Illustrator user you are. So without further ado, appearance panel. First, I'm going to find the appearance panel. So we're going to go Window, Appearance. And like anything else, it will just appear on its own up here. I'm going to throw this up above the layer hierarchy. First of all, the appearance panel is a collection of information about the item you have selected, whether that's a group, a layer, or an object. And you'll see that depending on what I have selected, the information changes in the appearance panel. So by default, the appearance panel is going to show you really basic stuff. In this case, it's just showing what the opacity is of this text object that I have selected. And you can change the opacity level. You can change the layer blend mode, much like you can in Photoshop. And then there are some more advanced features that I won't get into in this tutorial. First of all, we'll talk about opacities. In this opacities group over here, I have a series of ellipses, and I can change the opacity of the stroke, the fill, and the object, all independent of each other. Actually, I'm going to open up a couple more windows here. First of all, I'm going to grab color, and I'm going to grab stroke, and I'm going to show options for stroke, just because I like to have all this stuff available. So I'm going to set the stroke to 5. I'm going to add a fill to that. We'll make that a green. And then I'm going to use the eyedropper tool to grab that, go through this. So I can change the opacity of my stroke. I can change my stroke to 50% opaque. And as you can see, I'm actually seeing the fill through the stroke at this point. I could also change it to multiply, which does what it does in Photoshop. But now I've got that on the stroke itself. I could change the fill to 20%. I can change the opacity of the entire object to 50%, which stacks on top of everything else. As I mentioned, you can set the opacity of groups and objects and layers all independently of each other. So for example, if I got all these things grouped together, if I select the group, change the opacity to 50%, that's a cumulative effect there. Effects are a whole can of worms, and they are awesome. So I'm going to go into isolation mode and select this object. Now, down here under effects, you get a whole slew of things, and I'm going to go over some really specific stuff, but this is a whole world of fun in Illustrator. The effect that I use the most is transform, which is under distort and transform. And this brings up a window here that lets you do a whole bunch of stuff. You can scale things non-destructively, like horizontal, vertically. You can move stuff. And you'll notice as I'm doing this, I can still see the shape of the object there as I have it selected. And this is going to stay true even when I apply this. So like I've got, vertical scale of 165%. I'm moving it to the right, 0.6 inches. I'm going to hit OK, and it stays like that. And that's because this is a non-destructive effect. And what that means is that I can just turn it on and off in the appearance panel. So if I go over here, this has a visibility column, just like the layer hierarchy. And you can turn that on and off. And you'll notice as I toggle it on and off, it turns on and off over there. And you can apply multiple instances of these effects. So I could add a whole nother instance of the transform effect. If I hit OK, it appears here. So the second transform effect, like maybe it's going to make my object huge, scale it up by 200%. That is another cumulative, non-destructive transformation that I've just applied. And I can turn these on and off one at a time. I can toggle them individually, have them both on at the same time. And if you click on the word itself, you'll go back into the transform effect and you can change it. And you'll notice that there's a preview checkbox here. This is going to make it so that you can see what's happening in real time. So besides transformations like move and scale, you've got rotations, you've got options like scaling, strokes, and effects. You can reflect things, X and Y. You can make multiple copies of it, and you can determine where the transform is being applied from. So in this case, it's being applied from the center of the object. Say I want to reflect X. It doesn't actually do anything when you're applying it from the center, but if I change this over to the right side, it's reflecting X there. Actually, hold on. That second transform is getting in the way here. So going back into here. So now I'm reflecting X off of the right side of this thing, and you can see it's reflecting X there. You'll also notice that the original object is not there anymore. It's being reflected, and that's all that's happening. It's taking this thing and reflecting it off of this line. If I change copies to 1, I'm making 1 copy of it and reflecting it over X. It's going to leave the original object there. And then same with reflect Y. It's going to flip it vertically, right? Turn on preview. You're not going to see that when it's reflecting vertically off the center. I would change that to the bottom row there. So now it's reflecting over the bottom edge of the object and creating 1 copy of it. So likewise, it's worth noting that the copies thing works when you're moving things too. So if I move this thing a ½ inch to the right and it's making 1 copy, it's copying it 1 inch to the right. If I change copies to 5, make sure preview is on, it's duplicating it 5 more times. So there are a total of 6 objects now, including the original object. I could change that to 10. I could change that to 100. And so on and so forth. And again, these things are cumulative, and I can do that in this effect. Say I want to make 10 copies of this thing 1 inch to the right. like that. I can add the second one. I'm going to change this from a, whoops, scale here and move it an inch down -1 and then go 5 copies. Turn on preview. Sorry, -1 is up, 1 is down. So now I've just made a checkerboard pattern by duplicating this thing over to the right 10 times and then duplicating the whole thing down 5 times. So these things are super powerful. And what's awesome about this, since they're non-destructive, is that I can edit this original thing and it's duplicating it in real time. So this is a great way to do patterning and other really cool effects. I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off, and I'm going to change this one to 5. All right, so the layer hierarchy indicator is over here. You'll notice that some of the targets are now filled in. They're filled in with a gray versus the ones that are empty. This is indicating that those groups or objects have a non-standard appearance. And this happens whenever you adjust the opacity of something, whenever you add an effect. It's going to change this target marker and make it filled in to show that the appearance of that thing is non-standard. So this is a nice way to be able to tell what you've changed the appearance of from the appearance panel. What's also really rad about this is that you can drag and drop appearances from one object to another. So for example, I can grab the effect that I have on this path here, and I can drag it onto the effects text object, this right here, just by clicking on the target indicator and dragging it. And you'll notice as I drag it, the target indicators that I drag it over will fill in, and then when I let the mouse up, it will move it over to that. So I've just now moved that transform effect over to the effects text object, and now I can just grab, click, and drag it back. And I can put it down here on this path. And you'll notice that it carries with it also the stroke and fill color information as well. Another thing that you can do is you can hold Alt and click and drag to duplicate it. And this is the same as if you click and drag an object and hold Alt, you'll duplicate it. A really nice feature. That concludes my absolute beginner crash course in Adobe Illustrator. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you got a lot out of it. I understand that this stuff can feel really complicated to learn, but trust me, work with these things and just practice with them. They will become second nature in no time. I'm Sam Shimoda. Until next time, peace.